I'll be right back, but we'll start in at 1:10. Oh, nice. Oh, yeah. That's a good accomplishment. Be talking about it for years to come. All right, let's get started. If anybody's straggling and coming in later, then we will welcome them with open arms. Okay, so welcome everyone. You are in the intro to bootcamp section of the bootcamp. I didn't really know what to call this. I've been calling it a workshop or a bootcamp. It's not really either of those. It's sort of just like a class. It's like a renegade class. It's not really a class. I don't have actual, there's no course number. The chair of the department knows that I'm here, but it's not like it's a little under the table, It's an open secret, but welcome anyway. We'll call it a boot camp from now on. I wanted to give a brief overview of essentially what we can expect here, what you'll learn, what the outcomes are, what's the purpose of this stuff. So the main goal of the boot camp is to just teach people EEG skills and theory. I make sure to break up skills and theory because they're almost completely two different things. The theory in this case is the book knowledge and the scientific understanding of what EEG is, how it's utilized in scientific contexts, and the skills are the more practical, experimental tools that you'll learn. So this is, putting on an EEG cap, gelling the electrodes, determining if the signal quality is good, and understanding sort of the more nuanced approach to data collection, because this is the stuff they don't really talk about in papers. So it's when do you interrupt participants because they're blinking too much, or when do you intervene with an electrode that is acting up a little bit? There's these things that everybody who collects data knows, but nobody really teaches formally. And I would like to teach both of those in this boot camp. So how are we going to do that? Lectures. It's going to be one way. That's mostly going to be the theory, although some of the skill prerequisites we'll cover in lecture form. We'll have hands-on EEG data collection. This is going to be useful for, again, learning those practical hands-on collecting skills. And it's also useful for when you act as a subject, because we're going to be collecting data from each other. And it's good to know how it feels to be on the other end of an EEG experiment, because that can motivate. I remember when I was first designing experiments, they would be sometimes like 45 minutes long, and nobody is going to sit through a 45-minute task. It's just not going to happen. And you don't really necessarily know that until you sit there and you're like, man, this is, even after 10 minutes, you're like, this is incredibly boring. I want this to end right now. So it's a very important skill. We'll also do hands-on EEG data analysis. We're going to take these signals that we record in this class and we're going to analyze them. I'm going to do this in a way that's pretty sparse, I guess. We're not going to start from a toolbox. We're just going to start from raw Python libraries and functions. We're not going to use MNE or EEG Lab. I'm just going to teach you how this stuff actually works, because it's very easy to learn how to use these toolboxes. You can just go on the tutorials or watch videos, but there's not that many people that will teach you what's actually going on under the hood. You can find out, what's going on because these are open source tools, but that can be a little daunting. So we're gonna start from the source essentially. So I was kind of talking about this a little bit before everyone came in, but why is this happening? There's a lot of reasons. I'm glad you asked. Number one is to train a larger set of EEG experimenters. So there's tons of people who need research assistance, anyone who can collect high quality EEG data, not only in UCSD, which is a massive EEG university for those of you who don't know, but all over the world. EEG tends to be more popular in the west coast of the US and like other countries. The east coast tends to do more invasive stuff. But there's lots of people who need to collect EEG data, and it's important for you. I think it's important for people to learn how to do it. It's also a lot of EEG. There's a lot of EEG researchers who will take data sets, work with other data sets, but they never end up actually collecting their own data, and they don't really necessarily understand what's wrong with data sets or how to tell if a data set is good or bad. This is especially a problem in the machine learning subset of BCIs. There's a lot of people who just download EEG datasets and will try to apply models to it and think that, oh, we can just fix anything with signal processing or machine learning. That's really not the case. You need to know what data, like what good data look like and what bad data look like. You need to understand the inner workings of how these data are collected, because some experimental problems can lead to downstream false positives and all sorts of shenanigans. And essentially, not enough people have the basic understanding to detect those things. So I'd like to fix that. I'm also piloting EEG courses right now. So I did a less structured pilot of this in Cogs 189, which I was talking about, and then Professor Shauna Colton and Janita Saw and myself are going to be doing the same thing for Cogs 179. So you guys are guinea pigs for that. I also have a couple of grants right now involving collecting high quality and open source and weird EEG data. So one of them is from HDSI. It's a Data Planet Fellowship, and the whole point of that fellowship is to essentially determine if it's possible to even collect high quality data in uncontrolled situations like this, right? So almost all EEG research is done in a lab with noise cancellation and very structured experiments and no distractions. But if we want to create brain computer interfaces or other devices that are going to work in the real world, we need to start understanding the EEG signals in those real world environments. And that can be very difficult to do in an unstructured approach. So something like a classroom setting like this is, a stepping stone towards more just free form EEG data collection. And my goal is to collect open source EEG data that can be used by other scientists, but also by other students taking courses similar to this. So, when I have students in COGS 189 wanting to do projects analyzing this or that, rather than pointing them to some random data set that I haven't vetted or they haven't vetted or don't even have the ability to vet, I can say, hey, we have this data that we collected in this class, and that repository will keep getting bigger and bigger over the years. And um, yeah, so that's another goal. And then also, yeah, so 3 and 4 are really kind of the same thing, but I separated them. And there's lots of other facets, but these are the main reasons. So who am I? I'm Ollie. I have been doing EEG research for 8.5 years. I started when I was an undergrad. I was actually in community college and was doing research at San Diego State University, and then transferred to UCSD and joined the DeSalle lab, where I still am today. I like this GIF a lot because this is the first brain-computer interface that I ever built. This is Penguin Bird. I didn't build Penguin Bird, that already existed. But I built this very simple one-channel BCI that essentially just detects alpha power, and if you're in a high state of alpha, which means you're sort of relaxing, the bird will dance, and then when you get out of that state, the bird stops dancing. I've come a long way since then, and I kind of cringe thinking about some of the methods I did back then, but it's a good way to learn, just build stuff, learn from your mistakes, and admire the progress you make throughout the years. I also have like quote unquote TAs for this class. I didn't know Simon was going to be here, otherwise I would have put him on the list. Aiden, who's right there. I have ranked these in order of most likely to attend any of these lectures. So Aiden is number 1 and the only one on this list here. These are essentially all people who have worked with OpenBCI Cytons before in my class. Simon has worked with them in other contexts. And when we go down, when we actually start capping and stuff, these people will help me go around and make sure people are doing things that seem to be good, because I can't be all places at all times. So I'll quickly talk about the bootcamp structure. This is hopefully was obvious on the little syllabus thing that I posted, but we'll do lectures on Mondays. I want this to be interactive, so feel free to interrupt and ask me questions. Although this is sort of like a renegade class-like thing, I don't want it to be, you're just sitting there bored, listening to information. That's not going to be beneficial to any of us. We're going to break it into essentially 3 50-minute chunks with 10-minute breaks, because I don't want to just be sat here for 3 hours a day. On Tuesdays and Wednesdays, we're going to actually collect EEG data. Tomorrow's going to be a little bit of a weirder day, because the first half of the day I'm going to teach you about the equipment and the software and how to use it, and then we'll collect one subject. On Wednesdays and subsequent days, we're probably going to record 2 people per day. We're going to see how well this works. We have enough people that we probably don't need to clean the caps in between sessions. Sorry, I'm looking over there because the caps live over there. But so we might even be able to do more than 2, but I don't want things to take any more time than they have to. Like if we end early on any given day, we end early on that day. This is a weird, like, class hasn't started. It's an in between time, so I appreciate you guys being here, and I don't want to keep you captive just to like make this 3-hour mark. And then on Thursdays we're going to do data analysis, and we're going to be analyzing the data that we collect on the Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And again, this is going to be doing data analysis from scratch to build a deep foundation. I might have theoretical slides intermixed just to explain certain concepts that are hard to do in code, but it'll mostly just be live coding, and I'll sort of say, okay, what should we do next? And then I'll try to do it, and we'll work through the confusion. As a quick introduction for the hands-on labs, we're going to be collecting data with the OpenBCI stack. OpenBCI is a very interesting company. They're an open source EEG company that develops their own EEG hardware and software. So in the middle here is, can you see my cursor? Nice. So in the middle here is the OpenBCI Cyton. This is an 8-channel EEG amplifier. Essentially, this means that you can collect from 8 electrodes at the same time. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the way to think about it. On the right here is their software, which is the OpenBCI GUI. This allows you to, in the top left quadrant here, to visualize the EEG signals coming in real time. You can also change widgets to sort of see the average power across different regions of the scalp. You can just look at the raw spectrogram here, and you can do all sorts of things. They have this little focus thing where they use a variety of different power spectral signals to determine if you're in a state of focus or not, and you can use that to make really simple BCIs. We're not going to cover things like that. We're not really going to cover BCIs beyond theoretical applications because, I mean, we have a whole class for that, COGS 189, so it's a little beyond the scope of this 2-week workshop. And on the leftmost thing, this is the actual cap that we're going to be using in these classes. So I have a bunch of these. They're sort of like a swim cap for those of you who haven't seen EEG caps before. And all of these little black things with wires are the electrodes that will get plugged into the amplifier. And it might be a little hard to tell, but there's a tiny hole in each of these things. And that's where we stick a nice needle through. Don't worry, it's flat. And we inject gel into those slots in order to make a good connection with the scalp. It's more comfortable than it looks, I promise. For the data analysis, we'll be doing everything in Python. I sort of went back and forth between teaching you guys EEG Lab, which is a MATLAB toolbox developed here at UCSD. It's also orders of magnitudes like the most popular EEG processing toolbox. It's insane. Like MNE, which is a Python equivalent, quote unquote, is about 10 times less popular in terms of number of citations every year than EEG Lab. But I wanted to do everything in Python because probably most of you have at least heard of Python and have some familiarity with programming. If you don't, that's okay. I'm not assuming you do. But it's a much more common language, and you're seeing it in being used in more labs and classes. So I figure Python is better than MATLAB for this case. You will need to bring your own computers for this. Again, this is just on Thursday. You don't really need your own computer on any other days unless you want to take notes on it. If you don't have one, I can set up one of these lab computers for Python, but these things kind of suck. They're pretty old computers. They're okay for what we're going to be using them for, but it might be a little sluggish on Python. So if you do have your own laptop, please bring it. And again, this is not a programming workshop, so I'll assume you guys know a relatively low to nothing about Python or programming. And in reality, most of the stuff we're doing isn't really programming. We're just going to be making calls on functions. So, you don't need to understand data structures or algorithms to do data analysis most of the time. Obviously, it can be beneficial, but for the type of stuff we're going to be doing, it's mostly just making individual calls to functions, which I don't even really consider programming, although programming knowledge is obviously very helpful. And I just wanted to throw this out there. I don't think many people fully understand this stuff the first time they hear it, just as a ubiquitous blanket statement. I know for sure that I didn't understand any of this when I was bombarded with it when I was, in undergrad. It takes a lot of time to grasp this knowledge, and you have to revisit slides and read papers and really think about it. So don't feel embarrassed or stupid or anything, because we're all stupid when we're learning something for the first time, and even the second time or the third time. Like, this stuff is hard. I'm going to be throwing out, I'm summarizing, even in the lecture today, I'm summarizing like 3 weeks of my upper division class in this lecture. So I'm going to be throwing out a lot of stuff. It's going to be confusing, and just ask and accept the fact that you will be confused, and that's okay. That's part of the learning process. Okay, so before we get started with actual content, does anybody have any questions about the class or anything? Could be random. Yes.
Just for future reference, like you said, for recording, right?
Yep.
Where will the recordings be posted?
Yeah, so after every day, I will post the recordings to YouTube. I have a link that I put in that email, but I can send out a link to the videos afterwards if you want. Normally I would post them to Canvas, but again, this isn't a real class, so we don't have a Canvas page. So yeah, YouTube will be good. I don't know if I'll record beyond the theoretical portions of the lab things, because it's kind of weird to record people capping and stuff. which is why I said in that email that the days that you really don't want to miss are the Tuesdays and Wednesdays. I will, if the volunteer, I'll need a volunteer tomorrow to sort of demonstrate all the stuff. If that volunteer agrees to being filmed, I will record that and post that on YouTube with the lecture, because it's good to see, you know, what does it look like to measure the center of the cap and place it on and that kind of stuff. Um, but yeah, and if you guys think there's a better place to post it than YouTube, let me know. But I have all my lectures posted on YouTube, so I think it's fine. I actually get random emails from people sometimes asking questions. It's kind of funny. What's up?
So you mentioned the new COGS 179 lab.
Yep.
Is that being taught this next year?
Yes. So the 179 lab that we're developing will be taught this spring. COGS 179 is not a very popular class for those who've taken COGS 189. It's like a 200 person class, but 179 is like a 40 person class. It's much smaller, and so Dr. Shauna Colson usually teaches that class, but this year one of her, I think, 7th year students is going to be teaching it. And Shauna is going to be sort of like acting as a weird TA sort of a thing, and I'll sort of be an on-call TA thing. It's going to be a weird mix of some days will be lectures, some days will be in a space like this collecting data. It's going to be, sounds like it's going to be pretty cool and strange. So if you can take that, if that's an approved elective for any of you, I'd highly recommend it. If not, you'll get a decent taste of what that's going to look like in this workshop. Oh, and also I didn't include this, but anybody, I mean, I'm going to be uploading this data initially to a private repository. But if any of you want your own data, just let me know. I will happily give you the data, and you'll have the scripts to analyze it. Just, I know it's cool to have your own EEG data or bio data of any kind, even if you don't know what to do with it. But you will know what to do with it this time. So yeah, you guys can, of course, have your own data. Any other questions? Cool. But again, feel free to raise your hand, interject at any time during these slides. I don't want it to feel uninviting, you know. There should be lots of questions. So, let's get started talking about non-invasive neuroimaging. There's a lot of different types of modalities for recording neural data. This doesn't have to, none of these are necessarily exclusively used on humans, but these are sort of the most common ones that we use on humans. So, for example, you can do primate or dog EEG, but I'm not really going to be talking about the viability or the techniques of any of these modalities except for in the purpose of humans. These aren't even all of them, but these are sort of the most common. You have EEG, which is what we're going to be doing here. FNIRS, functional near infrared spectroscopy. MEG, which is sort of EEG's sister, cousin, they're essentially the same thing, like clone maybe. Clone but looked at with a different pair of binoculars. I don't know. fMRI. I'm sure all of you have heard of fMRI. ECOGs, which also people call IEEG, and microelectrode arrays. This isn't all of the modalities that we use. There's tons of other ones, but these are sort of the most common. And they can broadly be broken down into two categories. So in the top, we have non-invasive, which are modalities that essentially don't require any surgery. They're not going to do any long-lasting or even really temporary damage to an individual. And then we have invasive technologies. Invasive always, in these cases, will require some sort of a surgery. It's hard to get them in random people. So most of the time you're working with people who already need to have a brain surgery for something. Most commonly, they're people who have some sort of brain disorder. Epilepsy is, I think, like 90% of the subjects who have one of these implanted. It's so you're not really studying healthy, ordinary, average people with invasive technologies, whereas non-invasive, you open the door to a much broader audience. And within each of these, you have drawbacks, which I'll talk about. So, you know, if you need to have a surgery versus not have a surgery, you might ask, like, why would anybody do, you know, ECOGs or IEEG when you can do regular EEG? And of course, there are lots of drawbacks. I really, really like this figure. It sort of puts most of the neuroimaging methodologies into perspective, and I want to draw special attention to the axes. So on the y-axis, we have size. in millimeters, but really we can just think about this with the labels. And on the x-axis we have time. And what this is essentially trying to show is the different trade-offs that modalities have. So let's look at something like EEG. We see that EEG is in the top left corner. This means that its spatial resolution, it's getting bigger and bigger, is not that great, right? It looks like we're in this rectangle that's imaging somewhere between, maybe a little smaller than a lobe to things that are at the whole brain region. But we can see on the time axis that it is incredibly fast, right? We're somewhere on the order of, it's saying 0.001 milliseconds. In reality, this is sort of arbitrary. You could put, I mean, like temporal resolution is sort of like infinitely scaling. You can get infinitesimally small. It depends on how quickly you're digitizing. And in reality, although you might not be getting a lot of change in activity, you can record EEG, with analog signals. You can record it with infinite temporal precision. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be reflecting infinitesimally precise temporal information, though, which is sort of why it belongs here. So when we're recording EEG, we're really not going to be picking up activity much faster than at the resolution of 0.001 milliseconds, but there's not that much activity happening much faster than that. So it's about as fast as it gets. If we look at something that's more traditional, or what most people think of as a neuroimaging technique, you have something like fMRI. It has much better spatial resolution, so we're getting towards the map or nucleus and even sort of dipping into the individual layer resolution. But you can see it's also much, much slower, right? So we're now in the, we're in the seconds category rather than, milliseconds. Oh, and sorry, I think this is actually 0.001 seconds, which is trying to say millisecond resolution, not 0.001 milliseconds, although it would also be correct with EEG. So that's where EEG is. And again, MEG is essentially the same thing as EEG in terms of its limitations and what it's measuring. It's just what they're measuring is slightly different, which I'll talk about. So the first thing to talk about, fMRI. Very, very popular. Who here has done an fMRI by any chance? One person? I've done fMRIs. You've done fMRIs? Yeah. Really interesting experience. You're put into a rather claustrophobic chamber. For those of us who have done it, you know that once you get inside of this machine, it is blaringly loud with magnets that are just constantly thudding like. It's really intense. You have to stay very, very still because if you move your head at all, it's not really going to be imaging the same location. Essentially, the way that fMRI works, again, this isn't a physics class or an fMRI class, is your brain has charged dipoles. What fMRI is doing is it's a massive magnet that is essentially aligning all of those dipoles. I think it's working on the hydrogen atoms, specifically on your deoxygenated blood. And whenever those things are aligned, you can get a very clear image of it. And what fMRI is measuring is the bold signal, which is the well, there you go, blood oxygen level dependent signal. I don't know what everyone just calls it bold. I never have to say it, which is an indirect measure of brain activity. So what it's measuring is the change in blood from certain regions, and the base theory is that whenever the brain needs more blood, that area is more activated. So it's not necessarily measuring the electrical potentials. It's not measuring the chemical potentials or neurotransmitters or anything. It's measuring this flow of blood to regions, and actually the flow of blood out of regions as activity is utilized. So it's, although it's very popular and very common and sort of the poster child for brain imaging a lot of the time, it's not even necessarily measuring a direct brain activity. It's measuring a metabolic response in the brain. But it generates really beautiful scans. MRIs are really good for, so without the F, are really good for getting the structure of the actual cortex, and even deeper brain tissue. And the resolution of these are pretty good. It's about like 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter voxels. So you can get a really, really clean structure of the brain, and this ends up being very useful for technologies like transcranial magnetic stimulation. So with TMS or RTMS, you want to target very specific regions of the brain and zap them with a magnet. And everybody's brain is pretty different. So we have different sulci and gyri, the folds of the brain. And depending on who you are, those folds are going to be different. So like if I'm trying to target a region here for somebody, it might be really at the surface, right on the cortex, but for another person, that same region is buried inside of a fold deeper in the brain. And if you're trying to target specific brain areas, you sort of need to know how somebody's brain folds. So regular MRIs are useful for that. That's a base definition for it. Again, it has very poor temporal resolution. It takes seconds to minutes. The sampling rates of these are really, really slow. Sampling rate essentially is just how often it's pulling a sample from the imaging technology. So we typically talk about this in hertz, but you can also talk about just the order of time that it takes to get one scan, for example. So this could be in the order of 10 seconds to a minute, depending on how deep your scan is, how many layers you're doing. There are technologies for trying to speed this up. This was a paper that came out, I think, last year, 2022, which essentially tries to, it uses some weird hyper parameterization to sort of get much faster resolution. So for example, this is in the millisecond order with fMRI data. So there might be some technological upgrades that allow you to get much faster fMRI resolution, something a little closer to EEG. But I'd posit that, the niche that EEG has or other non-invasive technologies will always be there because fMRIs are just expensive, right? So, I mean, you can see this giant machine, it's not going to be cheap. The magnet itself and the machines can be like, I don't know, like in the order of $20 million, but then they also need to be cooled with liquid helium, which is also very expensive. And in fact, I think there's some papers showing that fMRI researchers use a disproportionate amount of helium compared to like the global supply. Anyway, there's a lot of people who do fMRI research. It's very expensive. You have to spend like $1,000 an hour renting out the room sometimes to collect data. So this isn't something that you can have, like in your bedroom or something. Whereas EEG, for example, I mean, I have 13 of them in a closet. So it has its place, and even if this faster temporal resolution fMRI pans out, it'll get better temporal resolution, but it won't necessarily replace EEG. What's up?
Quick question.
Yep.
So the fMRI has to take back the lines that.
Yep. Yeah. So essentially, a dipole is it really can be any object that has some sort of, it comes from like dipolar, right? So think of a magnet. A magnet is a simple dipole, right? It has a positive and a negative, something that has a difference in charge, essentially. One of my favorite dipoles is like the eye. The eye is, well, actually, right? So, sorry, she's an optometrist, so I wasn't expecting to tie in optometry into this. But the eye is dipolar, so it has a difference in electrical charge from, the front of it to the back of it towards the optic nerve. And that's actually activity that you can pick up. We'll talk about it in this lecture, but like if you move the eyes, because they're a charged dipole, you can pick up that electrical activity. Just like if you were to take, something that reads electricity and spin a magnet, you can also see that activity change. The tongue is also a dipole, so if you have like EEG on your head and you like move your tongue up and down, you can also pick that up. Lots of things have dipoles or are dipoles.
Is it like are the dipoles like does the brain have dipoles?
Yeah. So again, beyond the scope of this workshop, that's more of like a neurobiology, biophysics things, but the brain and neurons are full of dipoles. I mean, you can model, you can sort of create these approximations of neuronal structure using electrical diagrams and stuff where you model neurons as capacitors and stuff. Yeah, it's What's a class to take for that? Cogs. I know Cogs 107A talks about that. If you haven't taken that, I think that's a foundational course. But short answer, yes. Uh, so the reason I drew this was just to sort of put Diana, which is a new methodology. This figures from 2014. If Diana ends up panning out, it would end up moving fMRI somewhere over here. So it has better spatial resolution than regular fMRI and better temporal resolution. So it'd be pretty good for the non-invasive techniques. For reference, all the things around here are like very invasive. So, optogenetics you really only do in non-human species. Same with single unit and patch clamp recording. You can theoretically do single unit recording in humans, but there's no guarantee of it. MEG or MEG, which I really hate when people call it MEG. It just sounds wrong. But MEG is another non-invasive technology. Also requires liquid helium for cooling, and has a very similar. It has some similar aesthetic to fMRI, except you're sitting down rather than lying down. You put your head in this little tube that has these squids, which are like these. Essentially, they're very, very fine quantum sensors. And essentially, what they're doing is they're measuring the magnetic fields of neurons, which are the same neurons that we're measuring with EEG, but we're measuring their electrical fields. So EEG is measuring electrical fields, MEG is measuring the same activity, but the magnetic fields generated from the electrical activity. Again, scales really poorly. You need to be in a magnetically shielded room. You need to be able to have an adequate supply of liquid helium. And it's also subject to the same artifacts as EEG. So it's sort of like, why would you ever be an MEG researcher? They have been working on these portable MEGs, which I think are very interesting. And I've always thought they look like the Orakai helmets. So like from the first time I saw one of this helmet, I'm like, I mean, come on. But you put in these little optrodes. Actually, I don't know if they're optrodes. They're some magnetic sensor. Well, there's a video about it. Let's watch the video. And it just look. Sorry. Can we just? It just looks so ridiculous, right? I mean, I know people say they look funny when they're wearing EEG caps, but I mean, come on.
So at the moment, if we want to measure what the brain is doing, if we want to measure brain function, there are a few ways of doing it, but one way is magnetoencephalography. The idea of MEG is that we can measure magnetic fields that exist outside the head, which are generated by current flow in the brain. And in that way, we can work out what the brain was doing at any one time. The problem with current MEG scanners is that they're very large, they're very bulky, and they're one size fits all. The gap in the market, if that's the right expression, is for a scanner which you can wear on your head. So you put it on like a helmet, you can wear it on your head whilst we're acquiring the data. So to build a reliable imaging system, you really need two things. You need very, very sensitive magnetic field sensors that are small, lightweight, and that can go on the head. That's what we have with the quantum sensors. And then you need a way to house them on the head. And so to do that, we built a 3D printed head clamp that would house the quantum sensors close to the skull, and it was designed based on a single subject head shape. I volunteered to be that subject, and yeah, so this helmet relates to two sensors which are over the motor region, the right motor region of my brain, putting it all together. You just fit. Yeah, so you fit perfectly in my head. The quantum sensors give us the magnetic field that are produced by our brain at any given time. And by knowing also the location of these sensors with respect to the brain, we can localize which area of the brain
was responsible for the movement, and also when that part of the brain was engaged in that certain task. Ideally, we'd be looking at something more generic, like something like a Python, which could be adaptable to any animal set size, and we could just hold the sensors. We don't need to build something specifically for just one person.
There are a number of challenges, but probably the biggest one we had was reducing the Earth's magnetic field. So if you want somebody to be able to move with a scanner on the head, and then scanners measure the magnetic field, you need to somehow remove the Earth's magnetic field.
So the next all these tables and my job is going to be to remove the Earth's magnetic field. That sounded more like a joke that helps new starters than anything else. The way we went through this was to build these two electromagnetic coils that produce fields that are equal and opposite to the Earth's. So the mathematics required to design these coils to reduce the magnetic field is actually quite complex, but almost challenge. But then once you've got past all of that, the actual link coils, there's bits of wood, bits of masking tape, bits of glue, bits of wire. So it's a massive contrast really what you do.
Housed on two planes, either side of the subject, and that keeps the scanner quite open. You can walk in and out of it. Crucially, it meant that the sensors wouldn't fail if the subject was even less tiny. And that meant that any information we get from the sensor, we knew was coming from the brain, be able to do these things. With this new technology, scanning babies, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds is going to become possible. So that brings into play a number of different disorders like epilepsy, but also things like autism. I think that we'll soon be able to really start to see the neural substrates that underlie these disorders in children.
I think that's super cool stuff. The only reason I play that whole video is because, historically MEG has always been this non-portable, has a lot of drawbacks, but I love the innovation in sensor design, and like they say, the I think she's actually a PhD student or a postdoc as well, the person who's the subject, but she says how they want to have a more generic version in a bike helmet or something. But in reality, like 3D printers are super fast nowadays, and 3D scanning is super easy. So we're getting into like printing speeds and ease enough 3D scanning that you within an hour you could scan somebody's head and like 3D print one of these potentially. So it's cool to see this type of innovation. And also this is something that is not necessarily interfering with EEG. So if you wanted to have MEG and EEG at the same time, that's something that you might have in the future, similar to the next modality we're talking about, which is very commonly paired with EEG, which is functional near infrared spectroscopy. So FNIRS is sort of this weird. It's trying to do what fMRI is doing, where it's measuring your blood as a proxy of brain activity, but it's doing it with these optical sensors, which are essentially measuring the near infrared spectrum, hence its name. Essentially, it's going to be there's two components. There's the actual optrode, which is recording light activity, and there's this emitter that is sending through a pulse of light. And as that light goes into goes through your scalp and your skull and goes into your cortex, it's going to interact with blood of different types. Some of that blood is going to be oxygenated, some is going to be deoxygenated. It's going to refract off of that and hit an optrode. And depending on the time it takes to get there and the properties of the waves, you can determine sort of what the signal was, what the underlying blood was like at that region of the brain. This is portable, so it's not like an fMRI. You don't need liquid helium. You don't need this crazy fancy room. It's also much lower spatial resolution, so you're not going to be able to do whole brain scans. You're going to be locked really on the top layer of the brain, which I've been saying this whole time, but I forgot neuroscience wasn't a requirement. We call that the cortex. So you're mostly just recording cortical information with FNIRS. It is sort of in this category where it's Not quite as good as fMRI in terms of spatial resolution. It's a little bit faster because you can sample these pretty quickly. And there's actually a new type of FNIRS technology called time domain FNIRS. This is mostly popularized by this company called Kernel, which manufactures these headsets, which I think are hybrid FNIRS and EEG. I think maybe they sell one that's pure FNIRS. But they claim that they can get much faster temporal resolution, about on the scale of EEG. So in this case, FNIRS and EEG could be really useful. EEG is still going to be much faster and much cheaper to produce on average. But if you wanted more spatial information about exactly what's happening at more precise spatial regions, then combining the two might be useful. So now we'll talk about EEG. I could talk all year about EEG, but we'll keep it somewhat simple. This is an EEG cap on a subject. I took this picture in like 2019 or something. This is with one of my research assistants, and I want to highlight what makes an EEG recording setup. So the most important thing are the electrodes. The electrodes do what their name kind of sounds like, and they record electricity. In this case, they're recording electricity on the scalp. So this is not in the brain, it's not touching any neurons, it's pretty far from the brain actually, yet we're still able to record electrical activity. I'll talk about what activity we're recording in a little bit. And the electrodes in this case are on a cap. So you're going to be hearing me use these words all the time. Cap usually refers to a soft fabric that you put on somebody's head. Doesn't have to be. So for example, I would call this a cap as well, even though it's just a hard piece of metal and plastic. Even this, which is sort of like has a lot of plastic, it's still a cap. Anything that goes on your head, I'm calling a cap. Some people can call it, they might call it a headset instead. Like they might call this a headset instead of a cap. I'm just going to use the generic term cap for everything, just so that we know it's the thing that's going on somebody's head with the recording instrumentation on it. Oh, I didn't hide these. EEG electrodes come in a bunch of different varieties, but they're broadly broken up into being either wet or dry and active or passive. And I'll sort of explain what each of these are. So wet electrodes are historically the most common type of electrodes, and what most people do research with nowadays still. It's what we're going to be learning how to do here. They use a conductive paste alongside the electrode surface in order to make contact with the skin. So you can imagine that if you have a lot of hair, like me for example, and you just put one of these caps on, there's a very low probability that the tiny little metal tip is going to actually touch my scalp. When you add a conductive gel or paste or solution, you're essentially making it so that, that column of conductive material actually touches your scalp, which is also touching the electrode tip, and that's what's going to get you that high quality signal. So it's not just the fact that the electrodes are high quality, but in this case that the solution is also very conductive and is bridging that connection between the scalp and the electrode. This example on the far left is a substance called collodion, which was what EEG researchers used a lot back in like the 60s and 70s, but some people still use it. It has the benefit of being, like in this setup, you can measure exactly where you want all of the electrodes to go specifically, so you can take every individual's head into account. Something like a cap with pre-placed electrodes, you don't have that level of precision. So although we do have a standard way of talking about where each of these electrodes are on the scalp, everybody's head is slightly different. The shape is going to be different. We try to get the right size cap, but it's not always going to be perfect. So if you really want to precisely talk about the coordinates of where electrodes are and stuff, you sort of want to be able to place them directly on the head, and that's where something like collodion or a gel paste might work. So yeah, this is collodion. This is an electrolyte gel. It's called Supervisc. And then this is a paste. We're going to be using a gel that's a little thinner than this. It's called Signagel. It's very commonly used. And as you can imagine, hopefully this picture shows, but you're going to be getting stuff on your hair as a result of using wet electrodes, right? So it's not like you're not going to come out of this unscathed. Your hair is going to be messed up, but the trade-off is that you get very high quality data. We also have dry electrodes. These are becoming a lot more popular nowadays, especially for brain-computer interfaces. The main benefit to dry electrodes are that they're much faster to prepare, so you just put a headset or a cap, which I'm going to call them, on somebody's head, and you essentially just have to sometimes twist these electrodes around in order for them to go through the hair, sort of like a comb, and the goal is that these tiny little feet will make direct contact with the scalp. They tend to be much less comfortable than wet EEG, although some of them are a little better. Simon can probably attest to the DSI 7's comfort, which is actually pretty good. These ones have, as opposed to more common headsets, these have 2 layers of electrodes. So they have like an inner one and an outer one, and that outer one has 2 purposes. It stabilizes the inner one, which also disperses the surface area, making them more comfortable. But it also acts as sort of an electrical shielding for the inner electrodes. It's a really clever design. You don't really, I haven't seen anybody else copy it. They probably patented it or something. But so the DSI 7 is actually a little bit, it's somewhat comfortable. But like Cognionics, which is a company in San Diego, they make a lot of dry headsets. These things really, really suck. They hurt. The OpenBCI dry headsets, I have actually gotten like scabs that have lasted multiple weeks on my head from putting these on. Anybody who's done significant tinkering knows that these are actually horrible. So there's trade-offs. Some people prefer them. So when you're talking about patients, especially people who are, have ALS or something, they've expressed interest in dry electrodes, even though they're less comfortable because it's just less of a hassle. Cleaning up can be difficult for these people or for their caretakers, so they'll sort of take the trade-off of comfort for fast capping, but also the ability to regain some functionality. I'm mostly talking in a BCI context in this case. But there's not that much evidence showing that dry electrodes are suitable for high quality research grade collecting. Some systems have been validated for sure, but you can't ubiquitously say that like all dry electrodes are sufficient for collecting research grade EEG. So they're not fully adopted yet. We also have the difference between passive and active electrodes. A passive electrode is just an electrode which is going to be made of some metal. Typically, nowadays, almost all electrodes are made out of silver chloride, but it's also common to see them being made out of just silver or gold or tin or even other metals like steel or zinc or copper, but you almost always see them silver chloride nowadays. And it's essentially just that electrode tip. That electrode tip connects directly to a wire, and that wire gets plugged into the amplifier. These are very cheap to produce. They're really common. They're really reliable as long as your cables aren't too long. As your cables get longer, you get effects from wire sway. So as the subject moves around or the wires sway, that'll cause some disturbances. But also, the longer your wire gets, the more it acts like an antenna for other noise. So if you guys have ever experienced this, I have a really cheap guitar cable that I bought like 10 years ago. Now, whenever I plug it into my preamplifier, even when it's plugged into my bass, the wire is so long and unshielded that I can hear AM radio on it. Like it's just passively, it's long enough and unshielded, so it's just picking up this radiation essentially, and you can actually listen to the radio on this cheap wire. To some extent, although these wires are much thinner and a lot less long than something like that, they're also essentially, the larger they are, the more they're acting like these antennas for noise. So you want to have shorter wires where possible. And also historically, passive electrodes were more common, but so were electrically shielded rooms. So in the past, almost all good EEG researchers had a full noise-canceled room and electrically shielded room within a Faraday cage. Nowadays, that's not as common, and because of that, they've sort of fallen out of favor for active electrodes. Essentially, all an active electrode is if you can see this picture right here, there's some circuitry on here, and believe it or not, that circuitry is not just for turning on this LED, but there's actually an entire amplifier on the electrode itself. So the goal of this is you have your electrode recording your activity, it's immediately pre-amplified, which is then brought through the wire, and then amplified for real. So the reason why preamplification is a good idea close to the electrode is because you're trying to minimize what we call the signal to noise ratio. So it sounds exactly what it is, signal over noise. If you have a lot of noise, your signal gets overpowered and you have a low signal to noise ratio. But if your signal is very, very high in amplitude and magnitude, then automatically you get a better signal to noise ratio. So in this case, most of the noise is introduced as the signal is propagating down the wire towards the amplifier in a passive electrode. So if you have an active electrode, what you're saying is, okay, I'm recording that signal and immediately amplifying it so that when it goes down that wire, it's the magnitude of that signal is, the relative power is so large that any corruption from the outside environment is going to look tiny. It's really not going to corrupt that signal as it makes its way to the main amplifier and digitizer. So that's why active electrodes are so popular nowadays. They sort of eliminate the need for a magnetically shielded room, and you can also get away with having much larger or much longer cables. A lot of researchers will still swear by the fact that passive electrodes are good enough, and I'll let them do that. So to give this table some closure, the active wet electrodes are sort of the best and the modern research standards. There are two electrode and amplifier manufacturers that, there's Biosemi, which is a very popular company. They're Dutch, and their prime system that everyone uses is the Active 2. That's active wet electrodes. The amplifiers that I use in my research are the Brain Vision ActiChamps, which are also by the name Acti should suggest they use active electrodes, also wet. Passive wet electrodes are still very good. You can buy them from companies like G-Tech. Also, Brain Vision has the Brain Amp, which sells passive electrodes. Active dry electrodes are not that common, but they're starting to emerge. There's a really good Nature paper that sort of tries to see if dry electrodes are good enough for clinical and research use, and the electrodes they use are dry active electrodes. And dry passive electrodes are definitely the worst out of these four, but you can still record EEG signals if you prepare the skin correctly, if you make sure that they have good physical contact with the scalp. In this case, you're relying less on, because you don't have this gel bridge to make that contact, you're really dependent on pressure to force these electrodes onto your scalp, which is why they can be so uncomfortable. But again, there's ways of mitigating the artifacts that you get from the noise in the room and from electrodes moving and stuff, and it's only a matter of time before these get good enough to be, the industry standard. I hope, because it would save everyone a lot of time. But it's a lot more nuanced than this, right? So really, we should be adding more dimensions to this. It's not just a table, because we have like actives and passives, and really there's like wireless electrodes, which are their own whole category. And then you have wet versus dry versus semi-wet, which again is its whole other thing. But you also have, like I said, the material that the electrode is made of and the conductivity of that, which is not constant. As you use electrodes, they get worse over time until you can't use them anymore. But it gets even more complicated than that, because in reality, you also have the way that you're attaching the electrode to the person. But you could add all sorts of things. I mean, you could put temperature into here because that also affects it. So it's very complicated, and I don't want to say that this is the full picture, but this is going to get you like 99. Like whenever people are talking about electrode quality, just assume all of these are silver electrodes or silver chloride electrodes, and this table is essentially true, but like if you really want to get into it, it's a whole thing. All right, any questions about this? I feel like this is a good place to field questions. Yeah.
So is the wet / active kind of like the most, has the most, credibility kind of?
Totally, yeah. So I would say, I mean, without doing my own data harvesting thing, just from the papers that I've read, anything after like within the 2000s and onwards when EEG really started to explode, almost all of those papers are using wet active electrodes. Back in the day, like again in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, passive electrodes in magnetically shielded room were definitely more common. But nowadays, the circuitry for creating these active electrodes is very well understood, and they're like cheap to mass produce. Back in the day, people were like making their own electrodes and stuff, so it wasn't as easy to fabricate active electrodes. But nowadays, this is like the industry standard. Um, but you can buy any of these, right? Like it's not difficult to go online and order a set of any of these. Even like the OpenBCI, they sell some active dry electrodes for their headset, although you're going through a third party company. All right. So this is a good figure that talks about the general setup for collecting EEG. Right off the bat, I highlighted active electrode because this is not talking about what we were just talking about. This has nothing to do with the circuitry on the electrode. In this diagram, it's representing the electrode you're recording activity from. So it's sort of the electrode that we're looking at. So this figure really gives you the basic setup for how most people set up their EEG labs and experiments, and what we're going to be doing here as well. So you have the subject who is wearing some cap with electrodes on it, and there's three electrodes minimum that you need for recording EEG. You need obviously the active electrode, which is going to be placed at the site that you're interested in assessing activity from, and you need the reference electrode. Now, what we're measuring with EEG is voltage, which is a potential, and you can't measure a potential from a single site. It's always a comparison. So in this case, you're going to be comparing the activity at your site of interest to some reference electrode. Typically, this is placed, behind the ears on what we call the mastoids, but it's usually some area around here that we consider to be sort of a neutral reference. And typically, unless you're interested in lateralized effects, you'll take an average of two reference electrodes. So you'll have, a left reference and a right reference. You compute the average activity of both of those, and you use that as your average reference, or your linked reference, depending on how you're doing it, to look at each other electrode. So in this case, we'd say, okay, how does the activity look here? What we're actually doing is we're taking the activity here minus the activity here and getting this signal. And then the grounding electrode is doing exactly what it sounds like. It's grounding the participant and the circuit in general to the amplifier. Once the electrodes are placed on the head, they're plugged into an amplifier, and the amplifier is essentially taking these signals, which are really, really small. These are microvolts that we're picking up on the scalp. And it's taking these microvolts and it's amplifying them to a much larger state so that the computer can have an easier time digitizing it. So that's the next stage. The reason why you need to increase these signals is because digital computers only have, they have a certain finite range of signals that they can pick up, right? Although we're recording analog signals here and they stay analog as they're being amplified, we need to turn them into some signals that we can send to our actual computer in order to load them into analysis software. And what we're doing is we're essentially taking these analog signals and we're converting them through a process called analog to digital conversion. And there's a bunch of different ways to do this. It's like a generalized process. But one of the things is you need those signals to be large enough for the ADC to recognize. That's why amplification is important. Obviously, you can have like more fine-tuned ADCs that work on certain levels, but it tends to be cheaper to just amplify the signals, put them through generic ADCs, and then send those to a computer, which are going to be recording those events. So by the time it gets to the computer, we have all of our EEG activity, but we don't know what's happening in the world, right? We don't know what the subject is doing. We don't know what they're looking at, what they're responding to. And that's where sort of this other portion of it comes at. So the participant is going to be looking at some event. Most of the time it's going to be on a monitor, but it doesn't have to be. In this class, we're going to be doing experiments on a computer and a monitor, and you're going to be seeing certain events happen. So maybe you'll see X's and O's, and you're going to have some task, which is going to be like, count how many X's you see, or every time you see an X, press up, but every time you see an O, press down. and we need to know when those events are happening so that we can look at the EEG activity synchronized to those events. And so what we do is we write our experiments so that they send event codes. And these event codes are going to be synchronized by the computer, or maybe sometimes they're synchronized by the amplifier. And then we can essentially look at, okay, what does the activity look like when people are pressing X's versus pressing O's, or looking at X's versus looking at O's, or even what does it look like when somebody accidentally says they saw an X, but really they saw an O. You can only really start asking these questions when you have precise information about when they happen, and that's a big part of the research that I do and what we're going to be covering here. Yeah.
So what is sort of like the limit here? Because I'm assuming like when you record brain activity, you can record at really sort of high hertz, right? But like the computer monitor itself is going to be limited by just how much it can show per second.
Totally.
And so, but that really wouldn't be a problem because it would only be a problem if it would be the opposite, right? Like if the brain recording sampling would be lower than what you're showing on the monitor.
Yeah. It's a brilliant question. So just to repeat for the recording, question is essentially, what's the upper limit on our sampling of this activity? So we have two different sampling rates in play here. We have how quickly the computer and amplifier are able to poll for the EEG, right? So how quickly am I getting new signals from the EEG versus how quickly are we showing new stimuli on the monitor, or like even recording somebody's inputs and stuff. And the reason I love this question so much is that it's very important to me because I'm a huge nerd and fan of synchronization, and most people don't care enough about this. But yeah, to answer the first question, EEG can be sampled arbitrarily high. So the most common thing you see for most amplifiers is, they're taking in an analog signal and they're digitizing it at 50 kilohertz. So this is 50,000 samples per second. This then gets downsampled typically to something much smaller, like 1,000 hertz or 500 hertz or 250 hertz, which is then actually what you're seeing on screen and what you're saving. The reason why you don't need much faster than that is, the brain only oscillates so quickly. So we're not ever, depending on what you're looking at, sometimes you'll see like 4,000 hertz oscillations in the brainstem and stuff. But with EEG, you're not really looking at things much faster than 100 hertz, and even that is like on the upper limit of what people are looking at usually. So you don't need something that's sampling arbitrarily quickly. That has to do with the Nyquist theorem, which I'm not really going to talk about in this lecture. So you're right. This isn't a problem, right? Our EEG is arbitrarily fast. Monitors, on the other hand, are more typically sampled at 60 hertz, 75 hertz. Nowadays, they have faster monitors that go all the way up to 500 hertz. And really, what this influences is how long the stimulus can be on the screen for. And it's a huge pet peeve of mine because you'll read a lot of papers where people say, okay, we have a 60 hertz monitor and we showed this stimulus for 1,000 milliseconds. But it's like, no, you didn't, because that's not divisible by 1/60. It's not possible to show it for that amount of time. So it's true that this matters in terms of how long a stimulus is actually displayed on the screen. But typically, the code that's being sent is not actually being sent by the monitor, it's being sent by the computer, and that usually has arbitrary precision as well. So you can say, okay, I'm sending you this image right now, and you can send a code to the computer. However, and this isn't really talked about in this diagram, but there's a delay between when that event is sent and when the monitor actually draws that. The very simple solution to this, which is heavily underutilized but I swear by, is to use something called a photosensor. So what a photosensor does is it reacts to, really a photosensor is a generic term for a class of 3 different common components: a photoresistor, photodiode, and a phototransistor. Most of the time we're using photoresistors, and essentially when the photoresistor is stimulated with light, its resistance goes down. And so you can record when this thing has been presented with a bright flash. Knowing that, you can make your stimuli such that, man, I wish I had I'm gonna go for for the classic Microsoft Paint. So if I know that I want to synchronize my stimuli correctly, what I'll do is I'll make like a little white section of the screen where my stimuli are. Right? Let's say that's what's happening, and every time I flash an X or an O, that area of the screen is also going to flash at the same time. I'm then going to connect a photosensor, which is going to be this guy right here. And wow, this really sucks on a trackpad. And I'm going to plug that photosensor into my amplifier. What this allows me to do is, with the same sampling rate as the EEG is being sampled, I can also determine when stimuli are shown on the screen. And then I can use the event codes to give me a rough idea of when to look for when that activity happened. But there's always going to be a delay between, so like the event code is going to be sent. So I'll call this event code. Wow, this trackpad really sucks. I'm going to wait a little bit of time, and then sometime later, I'm going to get my photosensor flashing, right? This time right here, this delay, needs to be corrected for, because essentially if you're going to be looking at the activity relative to when you get the event code, you're not really going to be looking at when the participant saw that stimulus. And because it's not possible, because the event code is sent much faster than the monitor can draw the image onto the screen. So what you need to do is you need to find this delay and you need to correct for it in order to say, okay, if you want to epoch, which is what we call the verb that we use, if you want to epoch or synchronize the data to when somebody saw an event, you need to determine what the actual delay was from when the event code was sent to when the monitor drew it on the screen. And so this delay is limited by the sampling rate of the monitor and just like the general monitor technology, your video card, operating system scheduling, all of that jazz. And the easy way to correct for it is to just use a photosensor. Nobody does this. Some people do this, but not enough people do this. It's so easy. It's effortless essentially, and you don't even have to do it during the experiment. I do for like my main experiments because I'm super paranoid. But what I find as a result is that my computers are very well behaving, so they don't ever drop frames and they don't have a lot of jitter. Jitter meaning the variation in when a frame is shown versus not. And so like all you have to do is measure. You don't have to have a subject there. You just take this computer, plug in a photosensor, connect it to the amplifier, have it flash a screen and send a signal like 1,000 times, measure what that average delay is, and then just like delete that number of samples from the start of your EEG recording. So it's really that easy. That's what we're going to be doing for this class. So you guys are going to be collecting data with the monitors with no photosensor on, and then after the fact, we're going to record the delay with photosensors of all the monitors, and then when we're analyzing the data, we're going to account for that delay. It's very, very easy to do. It's a great question though, because really, like nobody wants to ask or answer it for some reason. And responding is a whole nother thing. So like, for this class, we're gonna take the. I'll talk about it more tomorrow, but the way that we're sending event codes is super duper fast, and like it's faster than the monitor can refresh, but it's about the same speed as input mapping on the operating system. So it'll be we're going to essentially take the responses at their word for our event codes, but we can't do the same for what the stimuli are doing. The real way to do it, the real paranoid way to do it for responses is you build a special response box that whenever you press a button, it sends a signal directly to the amplifier and then also sends that signal to the computer. So that way you're not hijacking the response at the computer end. You're telling the amplifier exactly, like physically, when somebody pressed the button, and then you're also just giving the computer that information so that it can do things. If any of you ever find yourself in a situation where you have to do this, just ask me, and I will happily advise you on doing it. Again, I love synchronization. It's one of my guilty pleasures. I don't feel too guilty about it, honestly. Thank you. So on the left we have sort of our standard EEG setup. On the right we have essentially what is a representation of the scalp. The front is, subject's eyes and nose, back is towards their back of the head, and we have these standardized names for each of those locations. So we call this the 1020 system, and there's a lot more electrodes than just this in the 1020 system. This is an example of the montage that we have in the caps in our lab. In this case, there are 64 different electrodes, and I just wanted to point out the general naming convention for these. So on the left-hand side, all of your electrodes are going to be odds. So don't look at the actual big number, look at the names like FP1, AF3, AF7. You're seeing that all of these are odd. And on the right side, they're all even, FP2, AF4, F4. The letters broadly define what part of the, like what lobe or part of the cortex you're over. So FP is like prefrontal, frontal, central, central parietal, occipital. And then the Z stands for Zentrum, which is German for center. So like CZ is supposed to be dead in the center of the head, sort of like the central electrode, and then the position of all of the other electrodes is determined from them, which is, they're like roughly 20 degrees apart, which is where the 1020 system comes from. I can't remember what the 10 is from. I knew at some point, but this standardized location makes it very useful to discuss EEG research with other researchers that might not be from your university or even your country, because like, you don't want to talk about, oh, I see this activity is like maximal in frontal areas. It's like, it's just much faster to say like, I see maximum activity at FZ or CZ or PZ, or take the mastoid references, or you see SSVEP and other visual activity more present on the occipital electrodes like O1, OZ, O2, whatever. It just gives us a standardized way of communicating where on the scalp we're talking about things. This is a good time to say that where things are in the scalp does not mean that that's where they are in the brain. Okay? EEG is so far removed from actual spatially resolute information in the brain that it's just not fair to say like, oh, I recorded something from CZ, therefore, which is like right here, therefore that brain activity generated from like right under that electrode. That's not fair to say. And the reason for that is that the brain is this massively conductive volume, right? You have not only lots of cortex and lots of activity happening, but you also have all this cerebral spinal fluid around the brain and inside of the brain that acts as this massive conductor. And so, although there's maybe a higher than average or like higher than chance likelihood that like the bulk of the activity is generated from something directly under any given electrode, there's no guarantee that that's the case. And the reason for this is because of the type of activity that we record in EEG. And I realize I've been talking for a little longer, so I'm going to talk about this slide, and then we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back. But I just wanted to introduce you to our friend the pyramidal neuron, which is thought to be like essentially the type of neuron that we're recording from with EEG. So the pyramidal neuron gets its name because its soma, its like cell body, looks a little bit like a pyramid in structure. And what's interesting about pyramidal neurons is that they are typically aligned in these really large sections of parallel dendrites. So the dendrites are coming from the cell body, they're going outwards, and what you have is these structures where you have lots of pyramidal neurons with dendrites going straight up that are sort of perpendicular to the surface we're recording from. And this tends to be the best way for us to actually record electrical activity. So if you have an electrical field going orthogonal to the surface of the conductive material, you're going to pick up the most activity. And it turns out that, with EEG, we're not recording activity from 1 or 2 or tens of pyramidal neurons, but you can sort of see from how much material there is in between the pyramidal neurons that we end up needing tons and tons of them to be aligned. So typically when we're recording things from from these neurons. It's the summation of thousands or millions of neurons that we're picking up. So we'll take a little pause there. You guys can think about that. Let's come back at 2:35. That sound reasonable? Sorry, I'm used to having presenter notes, which usually has a timer on it, and I don't this time, so I got carried away. 2:35. Set an alarm. Oh, I should probably pause my recording to save some memory. All right. Whoa, did you bring enough delicious food to share with the class? I'm just kidding. Is that from Blue Pepper? I was just there. I feel like their food is not that. On record, I would like to say that their food is not that good. That's really not. It would do all right in Berlin. On the record, I'm roasting Berlin food. Right? Just all their food. It's very surprising. It's like, why?
France has great burgers.
Interesting. I don't know. Yeah. Well. Okay. So yeah, our friends, the pyramidal neurons. So again, this is the most of the activity we're recording from with EEG. At least that's what it's theorized of what we're recording. These are the same neurons that you're often recording with the local field potential as well, which is a more invasive technique. But we're recording it much less directly with EEG. So if you look at subfigure A, you have your pyramidal neurons, they're doing their thing, but then we have many, many layers before that activity actually gets to the EEG electrodes. So we have our pia mater, the subarachnoid space, the arachnoid, the dura mater, so these protective spongy layers of the brain so that it's not always rattling around against your skull. You've then got the skull, the scalp, and then of course sweat and hair, which are not included on this. So it's really, there is a tremendous amount of stuff between the electrode and the neurons we're recording from. And one of my favorite things, it's just like this beauty that we can even record anything by just putting electrodes on somebody's scalp. And tremendously, we can record a lot of very relevant information with that. It's not just like we're recording nonsense and noise. It's, we've identified things that are very consistently elicited across, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. And I wanted to bring this out there that all of these layers of protective material are sort of acting as a low pass filter. So I know not everybody knows about filtering. Low pass, it can be confusing, but because it's sort of, when I was first learning filtering, I'd always confuse in my head, oh, does a low pass like get rid of the low or let the low through? And you just have to remember to read it literally. It passes the low. So it allows slower, lower frequencies to go through, and it's sort of dampening the higher frequencies. And so think about like screaming into your pillow or something, right? If you scream into your pillow, you're putting a lot of layers in between, what your production source is. We're going to pretend we're the pyramidal neurons and we're screaming, and the pillow is acting like all of the protective layers of the bed. And imagine there's a microphone on the other side of that pillow. That pillow is also acting as a low pass filter. So if you ever really listen to what's happening, is you're going to hear a lot more of those lower bassy frequencies, a lot of these slower things, and the higher pitched, more tonal qualities of your voice are being captured by that pillow. That exact same thing is happening, although with electricity, as the electrical activity passes through these layers of the brain and gets to the scalp. So it's sort of just smoothing everything. Averaging is classically a low pass filter, right? So if you if you take, oh wow, that's good. Alright, so if you have some, just put some arbitrary thing. If you have uh, some set of signals right here, you know, although you have, like, let's say that these are some oscillation, if you're gonna average between any subset of these points, for example, if we were to average these 2 points, we would get this square right here. If we were gonna average these 2 points, we'd get this square right here. If we were going to average these 2 points, we'd get this square right here. These two, we'd get this. And what we're left with is something that resembles a much flatter signal, right? So we had this oscillation that was, oscillating at some frequency, not that fast, but still fast. And you're to, just to average 2 given points throughout the sequence, you end up having something that's much flatter. So there's like no oscillations in here. That's the low pass filter. So averaging is the simplest low pass filter. And it's sort of annoying, but like the easiest way to explain high pass filtering is like the inverse of a low pass filter. But it's like you don't really see a lot of natural high pass filters most of the time. So it's just difficult to give analogies for. What's up?
Wait, so it's called like low pass filter because like kind of lower frequencies like pass.
Exactly. That's exactly the way to do it. And again, it sounds silly because it's so literally the case, but it's still always confusing when you're learning it for some reason. I don't know why, but it literally just lets the low signals pass through. And again, eventually, I promise one day it's just going to click and you're never going to make the mistake ever again. But I remember like I first learned about these filters in audio processing. I'd always mess it up. Like I was always like, oh, I want to let my hi-hats like in and I want to block everything else. So it's like, do I need a low pass filter? Because I want everything lowered to like pass away, get out of here. I don't know. I don't know what my brain was doing, but I'd mess it up somehow. But eventually, I promise you will stop making that mistake. But yes, what's up?
Is that why the frequency range is like under 100 hertz typically, or is it the same for like electrical?
It's a good question. So you have some underlying limitations of so part of what you can measure is going to be limited by this fact, right? So even if you're recording LFP activity, you're still typically seeing oscillations like in the higher gamma range more readily than you're seeing them in EEG. I mean, maybe some oscillation researchers can attest to that more, but like you tend to see higher oscillations more clearly in more invasive recordings. With EEG, it's really uncommon to see things even past like high power and things past 30 hertz even. Like it drops off really steeply. To some extent, that's also neurologically limited because neurons they produce action potentials so quickly. Neurons have a refractory period of about a millisecond. In reality, we're not recording individual action potentials. We're recording these postsynaptic potentials of, again, millions of pyramidal neurons. So theoretically, you could imagine a world where you like have enough of these in a chain that you're sort of getting things faster than once every millisecond. But most of the time, these neurons are synchronized through some force, so you're not going to see this like sparse, like this cluster of 1,000 is firing, then this cluster to get like these super fast oscillations. And I'm talking about like in the like thousands or tens of thousands of hertz. But again, you do see some oscillations, like brainstem activity. You'll see that in like 4,000 hertz, and you can record that with EEG as well. But you're recording more like actually on the brainstem on like channel IZ. So take like OZ and go below that, and that's where you're recording information. So it's a combo. Yeah, the brain just doesn't oscillate that quickly. But then there's also pragmatic limitations like low pass filtering. So I know you guys are all wondering, where did EEG come from? It's a good question. Hans Berger always gets the credit for being the first person to do EEG research, but in fact, about 1 year before Hans Berger started doing his research, I think our boy Vladimir did the first EEG on animals. I think dogs were the very first subjects to be recorded. Hansberger was the first person to record EEG in humans, and that's, I think, why he gets sort of the most notable title. And also, it's possible that Hansberger started slightly earlier than our boy Vlad, but he was super duper careful and paranoid about publishing his results until he was super duper certain that he was actually recording something. So I think it took him like 10 years or something crazy like that to release his first findings because he was really scared of the ridicule and people saying that it was nonsensical. Amazing story for those of you who don't know about why he actually got interested in trying to record neural activity. You're what?
Yeah, we read it in Gary Mizaki's
Okay, nice. So maybe you can fill in the details because I haven't looked this up since last winter when I taught it. But I think Hans was serving in the military, and he fell off a horse and got pretty badly injured or just mildly injured, some level of injury. But at the same time, his sister, I believe, pretty sure it was a sister, not his wife or a cousin, but sister was convinced that something bad had happened to him and like sent a letter to uh down the chain of command, right? You want to clarify?
She said, and she had sent the letter before this happened.
Yeah.
She had said, I had a terrible dream that my brother fell off a horse and injured. So
Okay, so it was even more specific than that. So I thought it was less specific. I thought she just thought that something bad happened, but apparently she had a dream, a premonition that like specifically he fell off a horse. And Hans Berger, being a very curious individual, was like, you know, essentially convinced that there must be some psychic linking between human beings in order for this to, to have been possible. And so began, the actual systematic analysis of how that could be possible, like what mechanisms there could be to facilitate this type of connection. And that's how he stumbled upon EEG. So it was like, I think that's pretty cool. I mean, obviously that would have been all the rage back in like the birth of psychology and stuff, because Freud and Jung were all about that stuff, especially Jung. But it turns out that what he found was, not this psychic connection, but something that is intrinsic to each individual's brain. And the very first oscillations that were ever discovered were what we call alpha waves, and they're called alpha waves because they were the first ones to be discovered. Very simple. That's just the first letter in the Greek alphabet. This is a trace from some of the first EEG ever recorded. On the bottom here, we have, it's in German, by the way. What it's saying is that he recorded this from his son, Klaus. And on the bottom, you see this trace, which is a perfect sinusoid wave, and it's oscillating at 10 hertz. And I know that because he's saying that the time in between each of these peaks is 1/10 of a second. And on the top, we see the EEG activity from his son. And if we look pretty carefully, I mean, it looks eerily similar to the underlying wave. And if we zoom into a portion of that, we can go down here and we have our sinusoid 10 hertz oscillation, and we can actually physically count all 10 of the peaks, right? So this is a 1 second period, and I know that it's a 1 second period because I see 10 bumps in it, right? Because he said the oscillation of the sine wave is one peak every 10 seconds. And we can do that exact same counting on the peak above, and we see that it's also, 10 hertz. It's not in phase, right? It's like actually exactly off phase. What I mean by that is that, the peak of the perfect sinusoid corresponds with the trough uh, of Klaus's activity. But this oscillation was the very first human EEG activity ever recorded and the very first EEG phenomenon discovered. And there are tons and tons of oscillations, and in general, we don't talk about alpha as being specifically 10 hertz, but alpha is widely regarded to be around 10 hertz. All of these oscillations are in a range. This range is different depending on the activity that you're recording, the individual you're recording from, um, the equipment you're using, all of that. But alpha oscillations are very reliably recorded. We're going to each and every one of you is going to record an alpha oscillation just as like part of the setting up, because it's a very easy thing to generate. All you have to do is put electrodes over the occipital cortex and then close your eyes and relax, and you'll see some alpha activity increase. It's not big in everybody, but it should be there for everyone. What's up?
I'm just kind of curious, like, closing your eyes and relaxing, how would you do it, like, the penguin bird thing? So, like, was that measuring alpha, like, penguin bird, kind of flat?
Sorry, what do you mean?
Like, your first experience, like, the penguin.
Oh, the penguin bird. Yeah. That's exactly what I was recording. Yeah. So that's closed eye occipital alpha. It's very reliably generated, which is why I knew it was going to be a good control signal. Essentially, like, there's different types of activity. There's some stuff that is you know, sort of universal and can be generated without a complex task. So in this case, all you have to do is close your eyes and relax, and you can generate it. And then you have much more complicated things and oscillations that only happen when a certain event occurs or when these particular scenarios occur. So alpha is a very easy oscillation to record because yes, it exists in this closed eye alpha relaxation state, but it's also like completely ubiquitous across the brain. Like, the brain just loves this frequency range for some reason. I don't think it's 100% understood why. There's tons of theories why, and again, I don't want to butcher the oscillation research because I'm not an oscillation researcher. Um, but I just wanted to introduce the history of that to introduce the common oscillation bands. And again, I want to preface that these ranges are like heavily contested, but they're sort of the average of what people would consider all of the ranges. So the slowest oscillations you see are delta oscillations. You don't really hear a lot of people studying delta waves, sleep researchers mostly. But pretty much everything faster than that, there's people who spend like many groups who spend their entire careers studying just one of these sometimes. Uh, and again, I just want to say that the things on this right column, these are just sort of the most common descriptors of these oscillations. It's not inclusive at all, and people would debate all of these, you know, with careers of research. So don't take this as the gospel of oscillations because I'm not an oscillations researcher. Theta waves are very popular. They're especially popular nowadays with I know especially the Wojtek lab talks about them with like nested oscillations. So you can have more than one oscillation happening at the same time, and it can be difficult to. You need essentially you need different techniques to analyze these types of signals. You have alpha oscillations, which are very common. A subset of alpha, so there's these waves called mu rhythms, which are common over the motor cortex, and they oscillate at the same frequency, so about 8 to 12 hertz, but they have a very pronounced shape. They look like a mu, so they sort of look like this, sort of like a. I'm drawing a very bad job. They're actually a lot more sharp than that, but essentially, I can't really draw, so it's not great. But they oscillate at the same primary frequency of alpha, but they have sort of a sharp tail. They have this higher frequency component to them, and that's why they look like mus, which is why they're called mus. And that's typically only ever seen during uh, when you're not doing any motor actions or planning on doing any motor actions over the sensory motor and motor cortex. When you actually start doing a movement or plan on doing a movement, those oscillations dampen. So they don't get bigger when you're doing a movement, they get smaller. Beta is very commonly studied in a lot of contexts. I just put it's attenuated during movement because I made these slides for a brain-computer interface class, and that's what most people care about is motor imagery-based things. And then gamma is sometimes broken up into low gamma, mid gamma, high gamma, and ultra high gamma, whatever. I'm just mixing it all. It's definitely the largest of the frequency ranges. It's sort of just like anything faster than 30 hertz, we just call gamma and just ignore it, or people will lump it up and sum all of that activity and just say gamma has increased. But again, that's not necessarily the state of the art or the correct thing to do, but it's often related to higher cognition. But It's related to a bunch. All of these are related to everything a lot of the time. So like you'll read papers where it's like, oh, alpha increases is increased in autism, or it's decreased in autism, or it's increased in Alzheimer's, or decreased in Alzheimer's. It's all over the place. All of these signals are very easy to find, and there's not really a lot of good methodology happening in the oscillation space. That is something that like the Wojtek lab here at UCSD is trying to address with more standardized novel methods of processing, but um, there's a lot of what I will call bad EEG researchers that think oscillations are very easy because they're relatively simple to measure. You know, you record your EEG, you can take these large time scales and compute a Fourier transform to get the power spectrum, and you can just associate that activity with all sorts of stuff. That's very bad experimental practice, but that doesn't stop people from doing it, which is sort of why this research is all over the place in a lot of different subfields. But there's a lot of nuance. And then this was me wanting to explain nested oscillations. So, you know, you can see in this case that you have this this relatively slow, I'm pretty sure this is supposed to be a theta wave, and then within there you have these gamma bursts, which are, you know, obviously much faster, but you can still see the overall trend of the slower oscillation. It's interesting. This was a paper on talking about explaining, you know, taking these interactions and using them to model and express more information about the brain. Again, beyond the scope of even my understanding, so I won't talk much more about that. And one thing I definitely need to talk about is that just because you see power at a given frequency band does not mean that the brain was actually oscillating at that frequency. So this is sort of a byproduct of, you know, the fact that we have something known as Fourier's theorem, which is essentially that any time domain signal can be expressed as a sum of infinite sine waves. In reality, this isn't just true for time domain signals, and it's actually true in like infinite dimensions. I'm pretty sure. But essentially, you can take any pattern of squiggly lines that you draw, and you know, say those are all points moving on in time. There's a way to represent any signal, doesn't matter how complex it is, as a sum of different powers of perfect sinusoid or cosine waves. So what this means is that even if there's not, it's like you can generate a signal that is comprised of very high frequency waves or very slow frequency waves, but it doesn't mean that that activity is actually generated by the brain. It just means that when you're representing this time domain signal in, you know, Fourier space in the frequency domain, that is the power that you need to express that signal. It's a very subtle distinction, but it's very important. So I'm just going to say it again. Power at a given frequency does not mean that the brain was oscillating at that frequency. There are other ways that you can determine that the brain was oscillating at that frequency. So ironically enough, one of the ways to tell is by looking at the time domain signal, and if you can just see an oscillation, you know, if it actually looks like it's behaving like some sort of sinusoidal oscillation, then you can say, okay, the brain actually was oscillating at this frequency. So when we look at closed eye alpha, for example, this isn't an anomaly, you know. It's not like what we're looking at here is an increase in 10 hertz in the power spectrum. It's like we're actually seeing these oscillations happening. But again, that's not always true. And there's also, I mean, again, I'm not an oscillations researcher, but the brain is also not generating perfect sinusoidal signals. I mean, you can even look at Klaus's data, and although it's fairly sinusoidal, it's definitely not perfect. You know, it's going up and down. It has some really high peaks and some really low troughs, but a lot of them can converge down to being a little more mid. And you know, you have these weird bursts where the oscillation isn't really happening, but then it comes back. So again, there's a lot of nuance, and you shouldn't just take what activity is shown on the power spectrum for granted. You know. We'll talk more about the power spectrum when we talk about filtering on Thursday. So I talked about oscillations, and that's a massive body of EEG research. The other big body of work is on event-related brain potentials, or ERPs. You don't just get ERPs from EEG, you can get them from MEG, you can get them from ECOGs and other things. But I'm going to be talking about them in the context of just EEG-related brain potentials. And essentially, uh, all this is, to a simple extent, is activity locked to some particular event, right? So event related, that means some event has occurred. This could be a physical event, so this could be seeing something appear on a monitor. This could be pressing a button on a keyboard. This could also be a cognitive event. So you can get an ERP from some fully isolated inside of your head context that is not generated by some physical stimulus. Those are obviously much harder to study and to quantify, but it is the case that they are elicited from any type of event. And what this figure is showing is sort of the standard pipeline for how you would conduct, an ERP type of analysis. Each one of these within subcolumn E is an individual event, right? So this X is when one person saw an X once. This next one is when that person saw an X the second time. This O is when that person saw an O once, an O another time, X once, X another time. So these are all single trials, is what we call them. So in this case, a trial is just one instance of when a participant was shown a stimulus or responded to some stimulus. And what we do is, when we're trying to look at these individual single trials, they're really, really noisy. I'm seeing some oscillations, but I'm not really seeing a clear signal. It kind of seems like the O's have, a bit of a positivity around 300 to 500 milliseconds, but it's not really clear to tell. And so what we do when we're doing ERP research is we'll often average multiple trials together. And that's what subfigure F is showing us. So in this case, we're averaging 80 instances of seeing the X's and 20 instances of seeing the O's. And we're seeing these sort of, as you average more and more signals, you're smoothing out, you're getting rid of the noise, the true signal is starting to come out, and we're able to start seeing these things which are called event-related potential components. And there's tons and tons of components, but this figure sort of talks about some of the classic ones. So the P1, N1, P2 are very commonly elicited from just seeing a stimulus or perceiving a stimulus of any kind. So this could be seeing a flash of white light is going to elicit this complex, or hearing a really loud sound is going to elicit this complex, or even if I zap you on the finger, you're going to elicit this complex. And where it shows up and how big it is and how wide it is or whatever is going to depend on the stimulus and the modality and where you're recording from. And then we sort of see this peak at around 300 to 500 milliseconds, which is labeled the P3. So this is going to be the first potential that we actually record in this class tomorrow and the next day. It's one of the most reliably elicited components. It also is like the biggest of the components. Well, the P3 family in general has like the largest magnitude of any of the components. There are some that are around the same level, but this is very reliably generated. You get it in almost all people. And we understand the characteristics about what makes it larger versus smaller. So it's a really nice experimental component to generate. And I don't know if I had this on a slide, but I wanted to say right off the bat, because it's confusing at first glance, but a component does not mean it is a peak or a trough, right? So I can't just like take any arbitrary recording. Like, I see this peak right here. I can't just say, okay, this is a negative going peak at around 575 milliseconds. I can't just call this an N575, right? Even though it's like, oh, I've averaged over tons of trials, I'm seeing this. So an ERP component is not these peaks and troughs, but one of the characteristics of these components are these types of forms and shapes. So there's a couple things that make something an actual component. First, It's how reliable is it to generate. So is this something that you're able to generate from specific types of experimental manipulations? Are you seeing this in only a subset of the population? What's generating it? You also need to understand where on the scalp you're getting these signals. It's very uncommon to see the signals across the entire scalp. So it's like, is it more positive in the frontal electrodes, like FZ, or do you see it more centrally, like CZ, or all the way in the back, like OZ? Is it more parietal? Are you seeing it, what are the characteristics of it spatially? What are the characteristics of it temporally? And then what's sort of the morphological properties in terms of its peaks and troughs? But then also, how is it manipulated? So what are the factors that make it, present versus not present, or make it delayed versus early versus on the time that you expected? So it's this larger set of characteristics and how uh, they're manipulated that really make a component stand out. Um, the only reason I'm saying that is because there's a lot of researchers that don't really understand this research that well, that will sort of just see peaks or troughs emerging from averages from an experiment, and they get like, 500 people or whatever, and they're like, oh, this is a component, and I know because it's like it looks like a component. It's not that simple. It takes a lot of systematic investigation to determine, what's actually going on, and is this actually something that's a reliable, signature of the brain. Yeah.
I was still kind of like what are.
Yeah. What? So that's fair. What's the main confusion, I guess?
I guess are they just kind of like different like sort of patterns or like what kind of things you see in the averages of like ERPs?
Yeah. So I think using the word pattern is very good. So they definitely are these patterns, and they're not just a pattern within a single individual, but the things that you'll see across multiple studies, across multiple individuals, and things that have a very consistent set of parameters that affect them, right? So, for with the P3, for example, um, the thing that affects it the most is how common the stimulus is. So you can sort of, I'm purposely not talking about the task that generates it too much because I'll be talking about it on Thursday and when we're recording. But you can see that there's about 80 X's that we're seeing and only 20 O's, right? So the O's are pretty rare. Um, and it turns out that the P3 is actually affected by the rarity of the stimuli. So the X's are pretty common and they're getting a bit of a P3, but it's not that pronounced. But on the rare stimulus, we're getting a really, really big response. And so, as an experimenter, you might see this and you might say, huh, I wonder what properties affect, this shape. So, what you might do is you might say, okay, I'm going to run an experiment where actually X's and O's are just as common as each other. And what you'll find out is that the P3s on both of them are going to be pretty small. And then you might say, okay, well, I'm going to try to run this exact same experiment, except I'm going to make the O's even more rare. I'm going to make it so that there's only 10 O's and 90 X's. And you'll find that the P3 gets even bigger. And now what you've done is you've systematically manipulated the experiment such that it's just like it's just science, right? You're applying the scientific method. You're controlling for as much as possible, and you're measuring some dependent variable. In this case, that dependent variable is our EEG activity, and we're really interested in what's happening to that locked to a particular event. In this case, it turns out that we keep seeing this area around 300 to 500 milliseconds changing with these experimental parameters. And after you do enough of that research and you control for enough of those parameters and modify enough of them, you can start to pretty confidently identify like, okay, this is something, we got something here, right? Like this is definitely not a fluke. It's not just a random fluctuation in peaks and troughs. This is reflecting something about the brain, right? And that's really when you can start calling something a component versus just, a peak or a trough. In reality, um, a lot of the activity that we're measuring, especially 300 milliseconds onwards, is the summation of lots of components. So like we know for a fact that in this same time region, you're going to get a P3, but you also might get another component called the N400. And it's sometimes very difficult to design experiments that separate those two, like design something that only gives you a P3 but not an N4, or vice versa, generates just an N4 but not a P3. And we'll talk about this, but that's actually how the N4 was discovered, was during a task that was meant to elicit a P3. And, you look at this thing and you say, I wonder if this is a thing, and then you do a bunch of experiments until you're pretty confident that's like, all right, I'm pretty sure this is its own thing, different from the P3. And you do enough controlling experiments to isolate the two, and yeah, so it's nuanced, but I think keeping on this idea of patterns is very important. So it's what, and really patterns, but parameters. How does it look? What are the things that affect it? Is it being reliably generated here or here or here? How does it develop over time? How does it change in different subjects? So like then you can start forming hypotheses. Like you can say, okay, let's say the P3 is related to attention, right? So I'm going to measure the P3 in people who are like very healthy individuals and see how that looks, and I'm going to measure it in people with ADHD who have lower attention. And if you see lower P3, then you're like, all right, maybe this is related to attention. Things like that. That's when it starts becoming its own, you know, fully fledged component versus just some peaks and troughs on a wave. But there's nuance behind it, so it's fair to be confused. And I think honestly, a lot of ERP researchers would struggle to give a very clean definition for what a component is, because it's sort of an amalgamation of a lot of things. It's more of like a framework for talking about something rather than this is one thing,
So it's like kind of just like a general, like,
It's an idea, but it's an idea that is, it's like a theory almost. It's like we all know what we're talking about with components, but we're not necessarily saying that these are, you know, real, or this is like a true representation of some state, but it is a representation of some state, and it is reliable and behaves in predictable, manipulable ways that allows us to have confidence that it exists, just like how we're confident that gravity exists. Even, you know what I mean? Like it's so it's not like just an idea or a concept. It's definitely they're real in this context that all science is real, but I don't want to get into this realism versus instrumentationist philosophical debate, although it's fun. Yeah.
I don't know if this helps at all, but the way that I think of it is Steve said had a word for like herpology.
Yeah.
It's just people who study
Totally.
like, find components.
Yep.
But that's not really the goal of psychology. You want to understand cognitive processes.
Totally.
If you just say like I have a component here, it's like great. If you don't understand how to change it, then how are you ever gonna connect that to things like attention or surprise?
Totally. Exactly. So Steve Luck this is from his book, which is sort of like the book to read if you're interested in doing ERP work. But it's true. I mean, I've heard this same philosophy from like all of the great ERP researchers. It's sort of a waste of time to just search for components, because what we're really trying to do is we're looking for these signatures that are related to some cognitive events that are happening. Otherwise, they're sort of like irrelevant. Yeah.
Yeah, people use like modern machine learning approaches to kind of go from like non like biased ERP labeling or component labeling
Yep.
towards explaining what the response was or what the stimulus was.
So sort of taking the backwards approach
Yeah.
of taking EEG and
Like-
determining which event happened.
It's like, oh, during this time period,
Yep.
let's call it like arbitrary component name. That's the one that explains the most of what happened.
The short answer is yes, people are doing this. It has mixed effectiveness. One of the main problems is that it's hard to get enough data for these more complex models to confidently make these predictions. But especially, it's becoming more popular now with more continuously recorded, naturalized studies. So, like, let's say you're recording from somebody for 24 hours a day, and they're doing all sorts of stuff. It's difficult to label those events, but you still want to try to have some idea of when people's states change or if there's sort of reliable patterns. So those are the contexts where these things are being experimented on the most. There's also something that's very closely related, not exactly what you're saying, but give somebody, give an algorithm data and ask it to find known components. So that's sort of like an intermediate step, and even that is difficult. Like even looking for known components, especially in single trials. So what we're seeing in F are averages of tens of trials, but when you're solving this problem of looking for new things or looking for single variations of one thing, you're dealing with signals like this. And actually, like these are much cleaner than what you're seeing in real single trials because they're illustrations. So you can imagine that it's pretty difficult. Again, not impossible, but that is still a relatively young field. And the other thing, which um, I don't think I have slides on because I didn't think I would talk about it, but it's good to talk about, is that EEG signals are non-stationary. So what that means is that over time, as you're recording signals, the characteristics of those signals are going to be changing. So if I record activity from you at time 0, and then I record that same experiment from you like 2 hours later, 3 hours later, although the signals will look similar, they're not going to look exactly the same. They're going to be changing over time, and they'll adapt with age, and they also change between individuals. So like one person's single trial P3s, first of all, they're all going to look different from each other. All the single trials are going to look different, but they're also going to look totally different from other people's single trial P3s. And that's when we get into these problems of transfer learning, which again is a huge subset of a lot of the computational work going into these fields. Is how can we find these patterns that are more reliable across single individuals in multiple sessions, but also across multiple individuals. Uh, Again, I don't want to focus too much on brain-computer interfaces, but when we're making BCIs, we need to record often some training data for those systems. So you get a subject in, you have them record maybe like 30 minutes worth of training data, which you're then using to train models on, and then that person can actually attempt to do something in real time. But it's very difficult to grab somebody in and not do any training and use the training data from another subject, or even use that subject's data from a previous session and get even close to the same results. So it's like you're going. Sometimes it can be like an order of magnitude worse performance. So it's a very tricky problem to find these patterns. But yeah, people are working on it with limited success. Great questions. I love these. This is a little GIF that I showed of sort of the evolution of a potential. This is a P3 study as you average more and more epochs. So in this case, an epoch, and yes, in almost all contexts, I would pronounce this epic or epoch, but within the lab that I came from, we all pronounce it epoch, and so I will always from now on pronounce it epoch. Epoch is used as uh, essentially a way to talk about a chunk of time. So you take one trial, you grab a certain portion of that data. In this case, I'm taking the data 0 seconds, which is exactly when the stimulus starts, all the way to 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second after the stimulus starts, and that's what I'm defining as my epoch. And then each individual epoch is being averaged up into this averaged ERP. And as you can see, as you add more and more trials, this general shape starts to emerge, and it becomes a lot more clear about what the signal that we have from this particular task is. And again, I just really want to drill the fact in that the single trials are very, very hard to gain information from, but it's like the foundation of all brain-computer interfaces is using these single trials. Not all of them, but like modern ones. All right, what time is it? I say let's take another break. It's been about an hour since the last one. And then we'll meet back let's just come back at 3:30, and then we'll just finish off with another 30 minutes. Whatever I don't finish today, I'll work into something else. We'll go through all the material, don't worry. All right, let's take a quick break. Let me pause my recording again. Wrong. Let me make sure that's still recording. Yep. Okay. So I just wanted to quickly introduce a couple of the common ERP components that we study with EEG. These are, again, it's not inclusive, but these are some of the most cited components. We have the face perception N170, which, as you can imagine, is related to when you see a face. Very interesting potential. You'll also get an N170 from people who are experts in certain domains. You'll get an N170 from those stimuli, and you also have a stronger N170 for your own face versus other people's faces, and a bigger N170 for familiar faces than random faces. So it's sort of like, again, we're sort of talking about the differences in the parameters that affect the N170. The mismatch negativity, or MMN, it's a very interesting component in a lot of ways because it's one of the few components that you reference with a single lateral electrode. So most of the time, you don't want to bias your reference to one hemisphere of the brain because sometimes there are hemispheric differences on certain tasks. But the N170 is the only component that I can think of that's not uncommon to just take one of the mastoids as a reference rather than the average of the mastoids. Very strange. Really interesting, like neurological properties for why people do that. The visual search N2PC is very popularly studied by the authors that wrote this, Kapman and Luck. They're like the N2PC researchers. Honestly, I don't think the N2PC is that commonly cited, but they're obviously big fans of it, so they have it in here. This is an interesting task. It's very, very dependent on keeping your eyes fixated on the center of the screen because it's essentially a visual field distraction based task. So this is a type of task where you want to be absolutely sure that people aren't moving their eyes. And if they are, you want to discard those trials essentially, because if you move your eyes, then the whole nature of the task has fundamentally changed. The word pair judgment task, which elicits the N400, this was that component I was talking about. Again, discovered accidentally and then systematically verified during a P3 study, which is right below it, active visual oddball. This is what we're going to be doing this week on Tuesday and Wednesday. The N400 is what we're going to be doing next week on Tuesday and Wednesday. And then the flankers task, which generates the error-related negativity, or ERN, and the lateralized readiness potential. The ERN is one of the most common quote-unquote error potentials, which is sort of a generic term that people use to describe any activity that's elicited from errors. It's actually the component that I started off studying when I was at my old lab, so I know a lot about the ERN. What's nice about the active visual oddball task that we're doing, the active in this case, again, has nothing to do with active electrode. It means that the person is actively responding to something. So a passive task, like in the passive auditory MMN, you're not doing anything besides just listening to stimuli. You don't have a goal. You're not responding to anything. You're just perceiving these stimuli. Sometimes there's even a distractor task that you're doing while the MMN task is happening in the background. Most of the time, oddball tasks are passive oddball tasks, so you're just sort of standing there or sitting there actually looking at stimuli, and you're not asked to do anything. Then there's different variations on active. Sometimes you're asked to respond, sometimes you're asked to count or pay attention to some specific feature, and ours will be responding with a keyboard on the task. And what's nice about the active version is that when you make errors on it, you'll also get an ERN. So we might be able to analyze the ERN component from this data we record, depending on how many errors we get. But I'm just throwing it out there. I think that's very exciting. Now that we've talked about some common components, we'll go more in detail into the P3 and the N4. We're not really going to talk about the other components, maybe the ERN in this class. But there's tons that you can learn about all of these. These experiments are from a paper which is called ERP Core. It's essentially a standard library of experiment files and analysis files to do, essentially to kickstart any would-be EEG researcher, ERP researcher's field or career. I've implemented the tasks, not in the same program that they use, but using the same parameters. And we're not going to be using their analysis scripts, but we can sort of compare what we've created to their analysis scripts results if we really wanted to. But this is great. Highly recommend reading this paper. And if you want to learn more about ERP components, the same authors, Kapman and Luck, have this thing called the Oxford Handbook of Event-Related Potential Components. It's sort of the dictionary of ERP components, for lack of a better word, and I refer to that and Steve Luck's other book weekly, essentially. Like, if you open my PDFs of those books, like every other page has highlights and notes and stuff. I mean, I refer to these things all the time. If you're gonna do this type of research, through legal or illegal means, acquire those books. It doesn't matter how you get them; they are essential for your career. Like, legitimately, don't feel bad for stealing if you need them to survive. That's my philosophy. That's not on the record though. That's on the record now. Piracy is okay. I'll say that. It's not stealing, it's duplicating, you know? It's like, I don't know. It's not like stealing a car. Artifacts of EEG. This is very important for all researchers, but particularly important for recording on low quality equipment, which is what we're going to be doing. So I really needed to make sure we talked about this. This is one of the lectures when I taught this class that I did not expect to take the full amount of time, but it took me like 2 days to talk about. So I'm going to just take my time today and I'll talk about whatever I don't get to today tomorrow, because these artifacts are incredibly important and understanding how to recognize them and what to do about them is also critical. So broadly, an artifact is any amount of noise that's in our signal that we're not interested in. This doesn't always mean that that noise is useless. It could have some very useful properties. For example, a lot of the times blinks are considered to be noise or an artifact, but there is some evidence suggesting that your blink rate actually reflects certain cognitive processes. So although it might be noise when you're trying to extract ERPs and look at specific components, it's actually a very useful signal if you're trying to do another set of analyses. Same with heart rate. Sometimes you get heart rate on your electrodes that are placed directly on your skin. And again, it's a noise for your EEG signal, but that doesn't mean that the signal is actually just blanket noise or useless. Same with the most common form of noise that we get is the 60 hertz line noise from, lights oscillating at 60 hertz and computers and monitors. But again, even that is not strictly noise. You can actually, the 60 hertz oscillations are not perfect. They have very, very small deviations. And you can actually determine exactly when certain events happened by those slight deviations. Like, I'm pretty sure people have gone to jail by getting caught with, like, there's some 60 hertz artifact in a phone call that they make or something, and researchers can go back, look at that structure of that 60 hertz noise, and pinpoint exactly when, because these structures like fully non-repeating. They're very, very slight variations, and you can go back and look at the record of 60 hertz noise in various areas and find exactly where that pattern matches and like determine exactly when somebody was in a certain location. I don't know how reliable that is with something like EEG or how reliable it is in general, but theoretically you could determine exactly when EEG is recorded by if you have the raw signal of what the 60 hertz noise looks like at all times and then comparing that to your 60 hertz noise in EEG. Theoretically you could do that. I don't know anyone who's done that, but anyway, all that to say is I'm calling certain things noise right now that are not necessarily useless. But most of the time what we want to do is we want to get more signal than our noise. That's what our signal to noise ratio is. And we need some strategies to deal with these things. And there's two main options broadly. We can either discard those noisy segments. So let's say we have a series of signals, like let's say 2 back-to-back trials where people are just blinking or yawning or moving, and that just distorts the EEG data. We can just say, okay, there's nothing we can do about that. That's corrupted. We're just going to discard those trials. Or we can attempt to correct the artifacts. There's various ways to do this. We can filter the signals. That's like the easiest thing, but we can also apply some more mathematically complex techniques to sort of model the noise and then remove it from our signals. So I'd like to briefly talk about filtering. I know I sort of drew an example of a low pass filter, but this is a very simple signal. All I've done is I've taken a 5 hertz, 10 hertz, 30 hertz, and 60 hertz sine wave and just added them together, and that forms this. This is just 1 second of that activity, and I'm just going to show what happens when you apply different filters to it. So in this case, I'm applying a low pass filter, and my cutoff is going to be at, let's just say in this case my cutoff was 6 hertz. So what does that mean if my low pass filter cutoff is 6 hertz? Is that anything slower than 6 hertz is allowed to pass, everything else is blocked. It's not allowed to go through. So in this case, all of these fast oscillations have gone away, and we're left with this nice pure 5 hertz activity. Again, this is simulated data, but the theory applies to real signals. And then this is a high pass filter. So in this case, let's say that what I did is I said, okay, I just want a high pass filter of 50 hertz, which means that any signals faster than 50 hertz are allowed to go through, they're allowed to pass, and everything slower is totally blocked out. And that's when you end up with something like this. So this is just a pure 60 hertz line noise. We're going to see a lot of 60 hertz line noise, especially with the equipment that we're recording. It's not really electrically shielded. We're going to get a lot of 60 hertz. Luckily, 60 hertz noise is very easy to filter out. We can just apply what's called a notch filter, which is essentially what it sounds like. We just say, okay, I want to take activity from 55 hertz and 65 hertz, for example, and just not let that go through. So everything is allowed to pass except for everything between 55 and 65 hertz. That's totally blocked. And then everything afterwards is allowed to pass. We're not really going to be interested in any faster oscillations anyway, so for us that's going to be totally fine, and that gets rid of most of the 60 hertz noise. It doesn't eliminate all of it. You can't fully remove it, but you can attenuate it, which is the opposite of amplify. Attenuate it to such a level that it's really not contributing to your signal that much. And I wanted to introduce Hansen's axiom, and it's very simple. There's no substitute for good/clean data. I think so. This isn't a real axiom. This is John Hansen was just an EEG researcher that was working in Hilliard's lab with Steve Luck and Marta Kudis. And actually, when I told Marta about Hansen's axiom, she's like, "What the hell are you talking about? You're talking about John Hansen?" I'm like, "Yeah." And she said that the origin for this was like it was originally like schlock in, schlock out. So this is the modified version for everybody, but it's true. There is absolutely no substitute for good/clean data, even though when you talk to a lot of people who are bioengineers, not to throw you under the bus, bioengineers, they assume that you can just like fix any data with enough signal processing or modeling, but that's absolutely not the case. Well, at least not currently. Maybe one day we'll have some magical algorithm that can fabricate data from nothing, but for now, there is no substitute for recording good/clean data. So let's talk about common artifacts. The most common that we'll see are eye blinks. These are very large peaks and troughs. I mean, they're absolutely massive. To give some perspective, EEG activity is usually in the microvolt range, and eye blinks are millivolts, so orders of magnitude larger. They affect almost all of the electrodes, but it's really only visible in the frontal electrode, so as you get further and further away from the eyes, you start seeing less of an effect from the eye blink. That's somewhat true. It gets a little more complicated than that, but generally true. It's pretty easy to detect these and reject them because they're so big. Like you can essentially just say, hey, I want to find anything that's bigger than like 100 microvolts, and with essentially 100% certainty, it's going to find every single blink with a cutoff like that, with just a very dumb algorithm. And it's relatively easy to correct. So eye blinks are one of the most, if not the most, corrected for artifact, right next to line noise, which again can be filtered out most of the time. So here's an example of some eye blinks. On the left, I have actual EEG data, and on the right, I have the electrodes that these data are coming from. So the first one is FP1, which is right here at the front of the scalp. It's actually right here where my fingers are. And then we go down to FZ, which is sort of right here, F3, F7, sort of things around this area going further back. And you can see that FP1 has a very massive spike. It's actually going above the cutoff for visualization on this plot. And as we look at the closer electrodes, we're seeing a pretty large activity in the frontal electrodes. But if we see things that are a little further away, it's not as potent. So it's not generally true that it's it's not just going to affect frontal electrodes. It's going to affect things all the way back, like even C3, which is essentially halfway down the scalp. You can still see it, but you can even pick it up on M1, which is like right here behind the ear. So blinks are huge. They will affect every electrode. You're just not necessarily going to be able to visually detect that effect. The reason why this is so important is because often when we're doing ERP research, we are looking at systematic differences in EEG activity. So, for example, let's say I'm trying to study fear and I'm looking for some fear potential. I'm going to show pictures of like teddy bears, and then I'm going to show pictures of like mutilated corpses. All right. Obviously, you can imagine that seeing a picture of a mutilated corpse just like flash in front of you might be a little bit startling. So you might blink, you might jerk, you might tense up your muscles somehow. And those artifacts, in this case, are systematically tied to only one of the conditions, right? Because when you're seeing the teddy bear, you're just calm, you're taking it, then you see a mutilated corpse, and that's going to be quite a lot. So the reason why artifact detection and correction is so important is because it's important in general, but especially in these cases where there's a systematic difference between two of your classes, you might accidentally make false positive results off of something that's not actually brain activity. So you might say, wow, whenever I see mutilated corpses, I get this massive peak at FP1. Any researcher worth their eyes will just tell you that's probably a blink, and did you correct for your blinks? And if the answer is no, then you're doing bad science. It's a very contrived example, but like you'd be surprised on how many things like this actually happen. Not all artifacts or systematic, conditions are that easy to spot, which is why we want to be very careful. This is the algorithm for detecting and rejecting eye blinks. It's called simple voltage thresholding. You typically do this after you baseline correct your data. Essentially what this means is you take your epoch and you make sure that it's centered around 0. The reason why you need to do this is all of your EEG activity is going to be offset by some fixed constant. It's going to be like on some arbitrary voltage. And baseline correcting essentially puts everything into, it centers everything around 0 so that your oscillations are going from like plus and minus 10 microvolts instead of, 22,000 microvolts to 22,000 minus 20 microvolts. Like that's the main reason we're doing that. And so therefore, if you're doing simple voltage thresholding, you can't just say, okay, I want anything above 100 microvolts to be rejected if like all of your signals are at like random variations. And this is an artifact of digitizing and recording. It's not a big deal, but baseline correcting essentially removes that offset and puts everything at 0. You can do this on all of your channels, or you can just apply it on your frontal channels, or if you're recording from specific eye channels, which are called EOGs, then those are the best ones to do this on. And you can even do this in real time. It's a very computationally simple algorithm. In this case, this implementation that I wrote, all it's doing is it's computing the minimum of your data and computing the maximum of your data and determining if it's smaller or larger than your threshold. It's very easy. You could also, take the absolute value of this and just check if it's larger than a threshold. I just thought that this was a very good way of illustrating, you're just looking for if the smallest value is below a certain thing and if the largest value is below that same thing. Anything that's extreme gets rejected. And that's that. If you want to instead correct for those blinks, you can use the Grattan method, which is a linear regression approach. And essentially what you're doing is you take the activity of the EOGs which in this case we're just using the vertical EOGs, which are going to be above and below one of your eyes. And those EOGs are going to be modeling your blinks very well. They're going to be picking up the blinks with really high resolution. And essentially what this boils down to is you have that signal and you're trying to regress it out of all of your other EEG channels. That method works relatively well. This is also computationally simple enough that you can apply it in real time. But it has a drawback. And the drawback is that although the EOG electrodes are mainly picking up your eye activity, they're also going to be picking up some EEG activity. It's not going to be a lot because you're pretty far from the regions of the brain you're interested in, but like the distance from FP1 to like EOG, the first EOG it's like nothing. So you are going to be, when you're regressing out the EOG signals, you're mostly removing the blinks, but you're also going to be removing some EEG activity from your signal. It's always going to be a balance of methods. You're never going to be able to perfectly isolate your signal from your artifacts, just because there's always going to be some mixing involved with them. I had a whole lecture in my other class about this, but the most common way that people remove blinks nowadays is through independent component analysis. Very computationally intensive method. Essentially, you take all of your activity from all of the channels and you try to split it up such that each independent component is reflecting one unique signal. And if ICA is working correctly, you'll get one IC that is representing your blink component. What you can do is delete that component, remix it into your EEG, and then continue your analysis from there. In reality, it's more complicated than this, and also after you do ICA and remix, your units are no longer in microvolts. There's in sort of like arbitrary relative units. We're not going to talk about ICA beyond this because we're not going to use it. Yeah.
So since ICA is so computationally expensive, is this Graton method used more commonly in BCI?
People have so Graton is used in BCIs. It's not that common. People have people have been using like artifact subspace reconstruction, which is another algorithm for removing blinks. It does a really good job with blinks, and just like slower oscillation artifacts in general. But people have people I think people have trained ICA off of your training data and then use that unmixing model in real time to remove blinks. Because the unmixing and remixing in synchronous BCIs, it's not like you're having to do this continuously in real time. You sort of get your epoch, you process it, and you have usually like at least a couple hundred milliseconds to remove that, remix the component, and then do some analysis on it. I don't know how common that is though, but to be perfectly honest, a lot of researchers don't do any real-time artifact rejection. Like they just leave everything in there and they're just allowing their classifiers to deal with it. But there are people who, again, like I use simple voltage thresholding to just reject trials because it's the easiest. I know for sure people have done Graton, and I know people do artifact subspace. The Schwartz Center, I think they have a version of real-time ICA, but I think they also mostly use ASR. Yeah.
What's like the downside to simple value threshold?
So, great question. The main downside to simple voltage thresholding is it's not going to give you your signals back. Essentially, what you're doing with this is you're just finding where a blink exists, and then you're just rejecting that trial. You're just throwing it all away. It's like throwing the baby away with the bathwater. It's not a correction technique, it's a detection and rejection technique. In most cases, if you're recording on healthy subjects and you're doing an experiment where you can just have an arbitrarily large number of trials, this tends to be a very good approach because you can just, I got a bad trial, I'm just going to record more data. The problem is, in certain cases, you're going to record from subjects who are in very special populations or with experiments or for components that you can only see the stimulus one time. So, for example, in a lot of semantic tasks that elicit the N400, the N400 is hypersensitive to like word probabilities and semantic probabilities. And so there's scenarios where if I have a sentence and then I show a subject a word ending that's unexpected, I can only ever record the true response from that one time, because after I show that participant that stimulus, every other time I show that person that stimulus, their activity is going to be more and more attenuated. It's never going to be the same ever as it was that very first time. So in those cases, you have no option. You have to find some way to correct for that artifact, or like risk losing that subject or that subset of the data. So there are edge cases where you just cannot throw away the trial. You need to do something about it. And that's when more complicated techniques like ICA or Graton or something start to shine. Yeah, great question though. But this is, in a lot of cases, you can just reject it and just collect more data. But again, not always possible. So this will be the last. This will be the last slide. So that's how we can deal with it with computational techniques. How can we deal with eye blinks using Hansen's axiom principles? If subjects are wearing contacts, have them wear glasses instead. So if anybody here wears contacts and wants to collect their EEG data tomorrow, please wear glasses. You can explain to the subject that they can blink normally and that the experimenter will tell them, to stop blinking only if they recognize that they're blinking too much, which is what we're going to do tomorrow. It's also good to design experiments that have a lot of breaks, because if somebody is just like focused, trying not to blink for long periods of time, they're more likely to like start blinking or to start moving or making even larger facial movements. So design experiments that have blocks that are relatively short and have lots of breaks so that people can move around, and blink. You can also design your experiments such that there are ideal times for blinks. This is not that common, but sometimes you'll see it where it's like blink right, like you can blink now, and then the next trial starts, and then it'll say like, okay, you can blink now, and then the trial starts. Uh, there's task constraints why that's not a common design, because it's essentially like making the task more complicated, because being told when to blink is like a subtask. So, but this is a very common method, so it's like whenever you see a fixation cross, you're allowed to blink. This is a strategy we use for kids sometimes that like cannot hold their blinks. We'll say, okay, just like you're blinking a lot, that's okay. Just like make sure you're only blinking when you see the plus sign on the screen, and like really try not to blink when you're saying a word. We reserve this for special scenarios because again, it's adding additional task constraints. Short blocks with frequent breaks. It also gives you the ability to chime in, so you can check in on the subject. If you see someone's getting drowsy or something, you can offer them some water or whatever, talk to them for a little bit to wake them up. So breaks have other benefits. Cool. So we'll talk about more artifacts tomorrow. Thank you very much for coming today. I hope that all of you guys come tomorrow. I'll, train you on that. You don't have to do that. We'll go over the materials we're going to be using to collect data, the software, and then we're just gonna do it. Oh, I'll talk about the consent form and stuff. I need to talk to. I know some of you don't want to sign the consent form, and I have no problem with that. I just don't know if I can even record your data if you don't. I have to talk to my advisor about that today, so I'll get back to you. But everybody is welcome to actually cap anybody who has signed the consent form. So you'll be able to practice the skills either way. So don't worry about it. But yeah, if you're considering having your being capped or you're open to it, please shower, because it's actually easier. Although you'll have to shower afterwards, it's easier to gel a clean scalp than a dirty scalp. So don't go surfing right before the class if you want to be capped. Salt water will almost certainly interfere with the conductivity. All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow, and email me if you have any questions about anything. Yeah.
I'll see you tomorrow.
Sweet. See you tomorrow.